Greetings and welcome to video 13. In today's video, what we're going to be doing is making some wooden planks to put on top of our bases to simulate wooden floors for our D&D and Pathfinder miniatures. So we're going to be using a product called Strip Styrene. It's sold by Evergreen Scale Models. You can get it at your hobby shop. And it's fairly inexpensive. You can get 10 sticks or for about $3.50. Now the two that I generally use, I'm showing you here. The one on the right obviously is a little bit thicker. They're both the same width. So I'm going to use the one on the left for this particular build, and we're going to use the one on the right in a later build. A video will be coming up for that in the not too distant future. There's generally two types of bases that I use. The ones on the left you see are the Wargames Foundry miniature bases, and the ones on the right are ones that I've created on the 3D printer. They both are really good for putting the small cadmium magnets inside them, so I'm going to be using the ones on the left for today's build. So what I'm going to use this saw. It's a hobby saw. It generally comes with a block so you can do nice 90-degree perpendicular cuts. But I'm not going to be using it to cut the styrene. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use that to score the styrene to simulate wood grain. It really does a good job of doing that. So I've got my piece of styrene here, and I've got a piece of ripped off Amazon box behind it because I don't want to tear up my mat too much. And I'm just going to put some pressure on and pull along the styrene, and you can see bits and pieces coming off there as it's fraying and digging into the styrene. Now you want to have obviously a fairly tight pattern on the saw, because if you don't, you won't be getting a very realistic looking wood grain. So what I generally try to do is go along it maybe 3 or 4 times. What I'll do is I'll flip it on the other side and get that as well. Now the other method you can use is you can hold the blade down and you can pull it like this. Now the one thing that you're going to get when you do this, just so you are forewarned, it's almost like if you're at the mall at Christmas time and they're wrapping ribbons and they want the ribbons to sort of roll up. You'll see that it does put a bend in the styrene, but that's not a problem. The glue is going to hold it down just fine. Alright, so the next thing we're going to want to do is make this a little more manageable. Just cut it in roughly 1/2. I'm just using a utility blade for that. And this is going to make it a little bit easier when we go on to the next step, which is just going to be doing a little bit of light sanding to it and whittling down the board plank, the long edges a little bit as well. So I got a sanding block that I'm using to take care of that. I'm just gently sort of rubbing it on the sides where I had the frays, and I'll hit the other side as well, and then I'll hit the top. The grooves that are in the wood simulating the wood grain are deep enough that a light brushing like this is just going to remove the excess styrene, and it's not going to negatively impact your boards underneath. Now that our light sanding has been completed, you can see the nice wood grains that we have in our little mini plank there. Next step is going to be the trimming down of the upper board, the long edge. You don't want them fitting so tightly together that there's a uniform or hardly any gap at all. You want this to look like it's from the old world and not manufactured in some plant in Illinois. So in order to do that, I'm just taking a smaller X-Acto knife and filing down along the edge. And you really only need a very, very light touch when you're performing this part of the build. You want to have yourself a nice sharp blade as well. So now you can see we have our plank, and we're going to be divvying this up into some smaller pieces. We have a nice wood grain on there. So what I'm going to do is just rough fit these. The goal here is to make sure that the pieces are going to overhang on both ends, because we come around in a later phase to do some cleanup. So since I've got the approximate measurement that I want here for the first one, I'm going to put my first bead down across the middle of this base. Now the one thing that I did learn, and you can learn from my mistakes, I probably would do it a little bit differently with the next one I'm going to do, but you're probably better off starting at one of the ends and not the middle, because what I ended up realizing was that the boards, when I started at the center like this, when I got out to the edge, the very edge, they were less than a full board each and probably about half of a board. So I think if I would start with this size again, I would start at a very edge, and there may be a little variance with the last board you put on, but I think it would still look better than trying to half cut a board lengthwise to make it fit. Now, it wasn't difficult to do that, but the thing that really made it the most difficult to do was just being very careful around that part of the base whenever you were doing your sanding. So what I'm going to do is put the rest of the boards on here, and I won't bore you with watching that. Now that the boards are on, we can see we have our overhang around the entire perimeter, or the circumference of the base. So the next part is going to be cutting that out. So I'm going to be using a utility knife with a sharp blade in it. So if you're going to be doing this, please, if you're following along at home, please be very careful because these blades are very, very sharp. So what I'm doing is almost a stabbing motion to make these cuts because I don't want it to have too much of a back and forth. I don't want to loosen the planks from the board. And you can see that it sort of produces a very rough cut. So the next step is going to be taking a sanding block and just working around the circumference of the base to make it a little more circular and a little less angular where we had made all of those stabbing type cuts. So here's the base after I've gone through and performed the sanding on the edges. I think it looks pretty good. The paint job is just going to be a black base. Then I used a umber brown base coating, and then I did a dry wash on top with a orange brown. I finished that process up with using some black on the sides. I just like the look of the black sides. So that concludes the base building. Now the next thing you need to do is just go ahead and attach your miniatures to it. Now on some of the older miniatures, the ones that are lead or pewter, it's a little more difficult to get the bases off. Some of the miniatures, like this old gypsy woman here, aren't quite as bad because she has a flowing robe. So all you need to do is drill a little hole into the base and a hole as well into the bottom of the miniature, and I like to use a paper clip with super glue on each end, and that provides a nice base. And then also I glue underneath as well. So you can see on this one, this was an easier one to sort of convert as well because she had the nice flowing robes. The skinny innkeeper here was a little more difficult, where I had to put one in for each of the feet. So this is a great solution for your miniatures that really wouldn't look good with the static grass and rocks on them. They're a little more mundane lives, should be reflected in the miniature. So that does conclude today's build. I appreciate you stopping in and checking the video out. If you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. One last mention, I'd like to point you in the direction of Black Magic Craft channel. He put a video out very similar to this one about a week or two ago, which used a coffee stir sticks. So thanks again. Hope you come back. Take care, everybody.